Okay, so this stage, what I'm doing is start to kind of like drawing on the clay and make decide where to put the wrinkles, the folds, and all the other volumes that give to the sculpt the organic feeling. As you can see, I'm really fast. What I'm doing is using the blowtorch, because the beauty of monster clay is that when you do those scratches and those lines, they all have like sharp edges, but monster clay reacts to the fire very well, and as soon as you use the blowtorch, everything like soften and get rounder, and it's very good because it makes the process of sculpting much easier, much faster. As you can see, I like keep going doing it over and over again. It's always like it's never just one process, step 1, step 2, and step 3. It's like repeating over and over again the same steps to get that kind of like layers on top of a layer, and have that kind of depth on every steps you're doing. Here's where I put more details and the stretches of the tendons and the skin. What I like to do, that is something that I found easy with monster clay, is basically do a little worm of clay still attached to the big, like let's say ball of clay that I hold in my hand, and then use it to place it on the sculpt, because if it's too small and your hands are too warm, or the temperature where you're sculpting is too warm, like what you see now, is what you risk is that the clay will melt and you don't know how to place it properly. In this way, you don't have to worry about the temperature of your fingers or the temperature of the room. You're able to place in parts where your fingers don't fit, and then with the sculpting tools you're going to make it blend and fit with the rest of the sculpt. You see, more I go into details, more times I use the blowtorch and then blend everything together. It's just repeating the same steps. While I'm sculpting, I like to change light, because if you make the light a bit more dramatic, it kind of helps you to see more what you're doing. It's basically, if you put like a straight light in front, even if you have the sculpt in front of you, you're not going to be able to see much of what you're doing. So having a dramatic light, it will help a lot to see better the shapes, and especially if when you're trying to match one side and another, you have like a hand, like you simplify the understanding of the symmetry of what you're doing. So here is doing again the same process of moving the light to make it more dramatic and go into finer shapes and volumes that I'm doing on the sculpt, like finer wrinkles and finer folds, because you start from like blocking out and then you get into finer and smaller details until you get to the texturing. Once I get to a point that I like the position of all the wrinkles and all those like thicker details, I always use a tool to kind of blend them together to break those gaps that are in between. because otherwise they still look like unfinished. So what I'm trying to achieve is to make it look more realistic, and to avoid to leave those very black and dark lines that I have. Because when you get, that's why the dramatic lighting help, because when you have that light, it show you how deep and strong are those wrinkles and all those details that you're sculpting, and then you decide if you want to make it less visible, because in a way it's kind of what you will see with the character on the screen. If you're doing, like, for example, a horror character there is working in the dark light, and there's just like some lights in specific places. If you make it too smooth, you're basically going to lose the whole sculpt, so you have to mark and make the details thicker and more visible with the light. So when I'm happy with the wrinkles and the first part of the detailing, what I'm going to do is basically taking like a final tool and start to break the even thickness of all those wrinkles. Some will be thicker, some will be less, some will be more like smooth, some others I'm gonna make the depth thicker, deeper. In this way, when the light is gonna catch the surface, you're gonna have differences between one wrinkle to another, one detail to another, and it's not just about scratching away or removing. Is at some point, like in this part of the sculpting process, I'm adding some more, because I realized that the part where the forehead and the eyebrows are going to join is too flat, and I want to give a more fierce look to this sculpt. I keep working on with different lights, so I keep moving it in a way that make me understand better what kind of look it can have with a different light. And I go back again doing some detailing. Another way to soften the sculpt, instead of using the blowtorch over and over again, it could be use a cheap plastic brush, because in this way you can get rid of the little bits of clay and start to soften down lightly the sculpt that you've done without going too heavily with the blowtorch. Here I'm bringing back some of the volumes and wrinkles that are on the side of the eye. I always like to go with finer and finer details, and then going to be disappearing with the other steps and process. But at the end, the fact that you've done it, even again, if they're going to disappear, for you going to look at the disappearing, in reality they were creating this kind of complex surface that will give to your sculpt a more realistic or more interesting and less boring look. And when you create a character that is a fantasy, based on a fantasy story, or it's not real, you don't have to get stuck into hyperrealism. So even if something doesn't look real but it look cool, that is the right one. So like, for example, now the connection I'm doing from one volume to another is not necessarily realistic, but it works for the purpose of the sculpt for the character, and then at the end when it will be painted and everything on set, it will look right. At this stage, I like to use like wrap tool. In this way, as you can see, I scratch everywhere, and it starts to kind of blend together the surface of the sculpt. To remove all this, I use a brush dipped in IPA, alcohol, or acetone. The only difference is the acetone, when it evaporates faster, and then alcohol stay a bit longer. And then I repeat the process again until I'm happy with the look. So basically, when I use alcohol, it's because I want the solvent to stay on the clay for a longer time. Because when you sculpt on the monster clay or on any other clay, when the solvent is there, the clay doesn't stick on the sculpt, and it kind of like easier to scratch away. At least this is what I feel. When I use acetone, is because evaporate faster, and plus the acetone when evaporate get really cold. So with monster clay, it creates like a first layer that is very cold and very dry and very hard, and you can go with a tool that is light, and you can do much finer wrinkles and texture. At this stage, I go again on some of the details and scratch and break, because it's important to not leave straight lines and just keep doing like kind of crisscross between the different details. In this way, it kind of look more organic, more chaotic. Even for fantasy characters, the wrinkles and details that I sculpt, they're always based on real details. Well, the fantasy characters that I sculpt, they're based on like, especially when you do wrinkles, on old people, or even animals like Sphinx cat is very good for textured and folds. So I'll keep using that, and then I emphasize a bit based on the character. This process is the one that I use for doing the skin texture, then the pores. There's a lot of people is obsessed with pores and the direction of the pores, and some others like to do like one by one. I personally found it quite alienating and frustrating after a bit, so I made myself a tool with 5 or 6. Well, this one for example broke one of the parts, but I like to have it with a lot of those metal parts. In this way it gives a more chaotic look in the pores, and it's not too defined, because what you risk is that at the end is just over textured. In the last few years of sculpting prosthetics, I realized that every time when I was happy with the sculpt and then it was applied, the texture wasn't matching, because we rarely have very thick skin pores. So what I'm doing now is just creating a layer that is almost the final layer on the sculpt, that basically break the smooth surface, and it gives that kind of matte look. Basically, what I do is for the whole face, I use a sculpting tool. Is this little rack tool that I made to make the paws, and it's like 5 or 6 pieces of metal. But then when I go close to the eyes, because around the eyes and the eyelids, we don't have the pores, skin pores. We have more like fine detail and fine wrinkles. I have a similar tool that I have just like 2 or 3, just like needles. Let's call it needles. So in this way, I kind of do the gentle blend from one texture to another. This other tool is similar to the others, but it's just a lot of other needles that is going to break and create some kind of direction. It's not really a direction, but between one pore to another, and it gives another layer to the skin texture that I'm trying to achieve. It's never just in one direction. It kind of follows the direction of the wrinkles, but at the same time it goes even on the opposite direction. I mark more, I press more when I go following the direction of those wrinkles, but then I even go on the opposite, like if it was like a cross, because it's important. Because if you look at your skin, your hands and your face, you realize there are finer and finer and smaller wrinkles that go in every direction. I can use acetone because it will evaporate much faster. And the result is almost close to the end. All you have to do is just repeat the whole process on the other side. I do use the blowtorch every time because it kind of take away the white on the monster clay after you use the solvents. This is a look of the way how I do texture, skin pores, with that tool that I was talking about before. The way how I use it is always like a bit chaotic. There's not an order. But I do press and drag, because in this way I create already some kind of directions, and it helped me to give a more natural and realistic look to the final skin pores that I want to get on the sculpt. There's another reason why I use solvents with the short brush is because it does, as you can see, from scratching the surface with the rack tool to do the pores, it softened down everything and it's less harsh. So in a way, it's kind of like closer to what we need. It's not just cleaning the surface from the dirt or from the dust. It's more like getting closer to a nicer look of the skin pores. And the blowtorch help again to soften down more and more. The last step is using white spirit. The way I use white spirit is quite aggressive. I like to use it a lot, and I brush it everywhere, and I start to stipple on top over and over again, because what the white spirit does, it starts to melt the very first layer of the sculpt, and you basically move around and create another layer of texture on top of everything. So basically the melted clay is start to fill the gaps of the pores and now the wrinkles, but when it will evaporate, it will get thinner, but will leave the extra subtle layer of texture. And then to end everything, I will use a short brush and some melted clay, always in white spirit, and I will spatter on top. And this is the last stage, the very last layer of texture and details that I do. This is very fine, it doesn't need to be thick, it's just something that I do to break again the surface. After this, all I do is just wait in there, it dry. Usually I do like before I leave the workshop or leave the sculpt and leave it overnight drying. So the morning after I see if I have to intervene again, or that's the end of the sculpt. I hope you enjoy this video lesson. There will be others coming. Every time will be a different character, a different subject, and see you next time.